Now, when we're talking about video games have had a very tumultuous time over the last 50 years or so. And one of the things that I'm going to do as I talk about this industry is I'm going to talk about how games were delivered. I want you to pay attention to how games were delivered and how people played those games, and they change nearly every 5 to 10 years. So it's something that's really interesting, and it drives home a point that I like to talk about, is that we haven't really locked down what games are yet, and as we teach classes like this one, we end up being flexible in our teaching methods in order to stay current. So the original video games were done on mainframe computers. These were huge $1 million projects that were done by universities, and typically the people who had access to them were PhDs, PhD students, grad students, that kind of personnel. Now, this was generally a highly educated male group, and they used brand new electronic technology to start creating games on their off time. There's a lot of really awesome stories online about people sneaking in and playing games overnight, and kind of and actually is kind of really fascinating as far as the American culture. You can kind of see where the roots of where gaming culture is today based off of who started creating games in the first place. So, and then of course we have Space Wars and Pong, which are the first two kind of big games that we see available, Pong being one of the first commercial successes, which was sold in the home. So first we go from mainframe computers, which were these huge things that had small terminals that you would be able to play games off of, to home television experiences where you have one console that you could play on the television. Now, this was amazing, and for people who don't understand how amazing it is to interact with your television, you are far too young. But home theater equipment was still extremely expensive. So what we see a lot of in the golden age of gaming, which is 78 to 1986 era, in the 80s is a lot of arcade gaming, because what they would be able to do is sell one arcade system for $5,000 to $10,000, and kids would come flock to play it, as would adults, and they would come flock to play these games because they couldn't have them in their own homes. But as technology modernized, the arcade gaming moved straight back into the living room with the Atari and the ColecoVision and other home theater and other home TV systems. Not only that, we also start to see handheld systems come up in the early 90s. Now, in 83, the video game industry took a really hard turn for the worse as a huge glut of poorly designed games came into the market, and also there was very little and there was a very young distribution system between video game developers and the retail establishment. So there were a lot of kinks being worked out, and it all kind of came to a perfect storm in '83, and it took a huge toll on the game industry, which ultimately recovered. So now we have these large, expensive home gaming systems and home PC systems, which are also where people used to play. Now, this was a primarily rich white demographic that was able to afford all this equipment in order to play games on this expensive equipment. Remember, this is the time where computers and personal computers were not common in the office, much less the home. So over the 90s, we see a large increase in home console gaming up until 97, where we see the internet really take off. And that's where gaming takes another turn, where we're moving away from the home console system and the idea of a 2 or 4 person game or a single person game where all the participants are co-located. They're located in the same space. Now we're talking about participants who are playing online, who are playing games like Counter-Strike and EverQuest. And those games are playing with sometimes hundreds of people at a time, who are connected all over the world. Then what we see after the internet hits in the late 90s is another expansion and shift in the market as we start to shrink the computer and start to put phones in everyone's pockets. So now we have mobile internet connected devices and they're beginning to be disseminated to every single person in the United States. Now, even though you don't really need a smartphone for most of the apps that are not games on phones actually drive a lot of the processing and graphical upgrades that we see on phones. What we did is we basically gave everyone an avenue to an interactive console that can also do other things, at least from my perspective as a game designer. And that's where you start to see the rise of this casual game market. Because you see, up until a certain point in the 2000s, we only had a very hardcore, dedicated fan base. But now we have people who may not be investing thousands of dollars in the equipment in order to play a game. They might be investing $1 or $2 in order to play a game for the first time because they have gotten this technological device in their pocket already. And that's kind of one of the complaints that a lot of people have had with casual games, is that they have very shallow gameplay. But think about it from the perspective of someone who's never played a game before. Those games are actually quite challenging. And remember, when you were playing games way back when, they were probably a lot harder and a lot more difficult to understand than modern games today, just based off of modern based off modern game design techniques. One really great example of that is pick up Diablo 1, 2, and 3 and play them all kind of together, and play a level or two together, and just look and see not necessarily what is different graphically, but look at the difference in streamlining between how you equip weapons, how you pick up loot. Look at all the things that they're eliminating along with the game design, even though it's generally the same game as Diablo 1, but there are huge improvements over time. And those are just kind of built into modern gaming. And now we're entering even stranger territory as we start to get into game technologies that have different interface design. We talk about the Wii Remote being an excellent video game controller for people who have never used game controllers before, because of the affordances that it creates for the user. But we're just scratching the surface. Video game controllers were just designed for one experience. Now we're creating new interfaces like the Wiimote, like the PlayStation Move, like the Kinect, and we have many different ways of playing games. We have them big screens, small screens, inside theaters, in malls, and shopping malls, and lots of different places. Not only that, we also have the emergence of high broadband capabilities within the home as Google Fiber begins to develop a market presence, and hopefully in the future we'll all just have better internet in general, fingers crossed. So we're looking back to the terminal-based gaming of the old mainframe computers, as we've seen multiple different kind of cloud computing services start up and try to do a lot of the video game processing on the server side, and then stream to a cheap phone or TV or whatever. It doesn't matter what the device is. And we've seen we've seen several of those services start up, and some of them go bankrupt. But with fiber coming into the home, and there's a lot of opportunities there to innovate. So what am I trying to say? Basically, we're just getting started, and stay on your toes when you're talking about how the video game industry works. And also, this is just a general piece of advice of stay knowledgeable and stay on top of all the new technologies, because it'll move by in an instant if you're not looking.